Hello. So today we're going to talk about melody now. Melody, as I've mentioned a few times, has a tendency to weave in and out of the harmony or the chords, and some notes in the melody belong to the chord and some notes in the melody do not belong to the chord that underlies it. The melody dances around and stretches away and then returns in different ways to the underlying harmony that it is singing on top of. And those notes that are not in the underlying harmony, those are what we are going to call non-chord tones. And there's a lot of different kinds of them, so it helps to have a few different classifications in our head so that we can say, oh, this kind of non-chord tone works like this and sounds like this and makes this kind of effect. And this kind of non-chord tone has this other kind of effect, and so on and so forth. So without further ado, let's start with some introduction to melody itself. Melody comes from this word melos in Greek, which means part or limb or member. And as I've mentioned before, melody is just one of many parts or voices that can appear in music that are that horizontal aspect. Remember that we've seen with chords where 3, 4, 5 voices singing like this, melody, bass, and inner voices, can come together to create chords. And those are all different parts or different limbs, and melody is maybe like the most significant or the most outstanding limb and the most important one. This is an interesting quote on melody from Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He says, melody does not only imitate, it speaks. So he's comparing melody and language and saying, melody isn't just an imitation of the way we speak. Melody itself speaks, and its language, inarticulate but alive, ardent and passionate, has 100 times more energy than speech itself. And I think this is a pretty effective quote because it gets us to think about how the language of melody itself works to affect us in a different way than speech, and according to Rousseau, with all that more energy. So this is an old melodic example. This is one we've seen in the reading because this was one of the first melodic analyses done, and this was 1739 by Johann Mattheson in his book The Vollkommene Kapellmeister, which means like the perfect chapel master or conductor, basically. And this is all the way back in 1739. So he's got a melody here. It's in B minor, it's in 3/4, and the whole idea with his analysis of melody here is to mark out how the melody starts and stops, so how it begins and ends, how it has a sense of being broken up into multiple sections, even though it's just a simple little melody. So this quote from around the same time, I think this was like 1780s, Heinrich Christoph Koch says, quote, certain more or less noticeable resting points of the spirit. Break up the melody and make it more comprehensible to us, make it make sense. And you need these resting points, these places of rest within your melody in order for it to come together to make sense. Let's take a look at how Mattheson and how other composers create this sense of beginning, this sense of middle, and this sense of end in their melody. So here I've marked off a few phrases. Let's listen to it. Good. So you notice I went all the way through straight through once. I actually ignored the repeat sign for now. And then I took the whole thing again and ended at that B in the middle of the second line. And the reason is that this is how he intended this piece to be read. But the more important thing to look at are these breaks, these points of rest after this first gesture. There's a little bit of a silence that comes in there before you start the next gesture, the kind of call and response. So if this is the call, then this is the response. Break again, and then call. Response. And then that's in an even bigger break right there. That's kind of an ending. So let's take a look. If I mark off these individual sections like this, at each break, you'll see that I've circled Matheson's own marking. So he's got commas here, semicolons, colons, and periods, and triple periods, and things, periods like this. The notation, the way that he makes his markings isn't important, right? But it is super helpful as a way to point out where those different kind of sizes of breaks are. So as we are speaking or as we are writing melody, we should think about how to organize our thoughts in order to make them comprehensible and create sections by having more or less having beginnings and endings of our gestures, so that these create little gestures, and they have that, like I said, call and response kind of feeling too. By resting points of the spirit, he means these little breaks in the motion that then start something anew. So again, it has to do with creating beginnings and endings and creating little resting points of the spirit, which again helps to make the melody more comprehensible to us, makes sense. And so now in modern day terminology, we call this phrasing or periodicity, creating of periods, just like we create sentences with periods in speech. So another really important terminology for phrasing is cadences. Cadence actually just means fall, or it falls into a close, and you can have stronger cadences and weaker cadences. A weaker cadence would be like a grand pause or something that is not quite done but has a sort of pause to it, and then a strong cadence is usually the end of something. And we'll learn more about how to construct cadences shortly. So as I say, a weaker cadence is a brief pause before returning to the beginning in this case. And then a stronger cadence can either function as a break, a pause, a strong pause, or the actual ending of the piece, which it does both in this case. Okay, so now on to a few melodic examples from Chopin. And I think Chopin is such a great melodic composer. He's perfect to use for looking at both phrasing and periodicity, as we just were looking at, and non-chord tones, and how they come to make that energy that Rousseau was talking about, that energy in the melody, all the more ardent and energetic. Non-chord tones play a crucial role in bringing that energy. So let's hear the very beginning of this piece. So you can definitely hear at the end of that little excerpt, it comes to a rest, it comes to a pause of some kind of cadence. And so you've seen, I've marked that with a blue arrow there. That is a more or less noticeable resting point of the spirit. You might also notice that this melody breaks up into more parts, even just this section. So we hear both this rest, bigger rest. So you see how the melody can even be sectioned further and break here in the middle, so that the gestures kind of mirror one another, or like I said, even could be heard as a call and response figure. And you see how they're kind of parallel in a way. They both have that ending for the first one, and then for the second one. And that parallelism allows also for that to be established as the feeling of the endings in this piece, those more or less noticeable resting points of the spirit. So that was the melody, and then we remember that there's also a bass voice or a bass line that works with it to make chords. Here's the bass line. But then, of course, there's also these inner voices that ring off of the bass. And those all come together to make the harmony of this piece. And they all work together to make those phrases too. So let's talk about the non-chord tones that are present here. Non-chord tones are also called embellishing tones or ornaments or ornamentation. And this makes sense, these terms embellishing and ornamentation, because of course, as I mentioned before, they're embellishing or ornamenting the harmony. So the chord is there, and then the non-chord tones are little decorations that then come back to the chord tones. We've learned already about leaps within a triad. We have an E minor chord here. B, G, and E. Coming in the bass, you can see E, G, and B there. This is just an E minor harmony. That's the left hand. And then in the right hand, we see in gold there, 5, 3, 1. So we've learned how you can already move around in a chord or leap around. So these are called chordal leaps in a chord. And they may also be called arpeggios. And arpeggios are just that, just chordal leaps. Arpeggios are big, usually bigger swoop ones, like. there is an E minor arpeggio, right? It's just the notes of E minor, just E, G, and B, but spread out all over the keyboard and played successively, not all at once like a big chord. But you can see how the arpeggio still generates that sound. Oops. Yeah, well, you got the idea. But if I just play this melody without the embellishing tones, without the ornaments, without the non-chord tones, it's sort of boring. It loses the energy that it had. Okay, this is not so interesting compared to... See how these two extra notes here add a whole lot of character to this melody and make it much more interesting, introduce little bits of dissonance that then resolve to the chord tones in the chordal leap. So what are we going to call these, or how can we classify these non-chord tones so we can use them in our own music? Well, in order to do that, we're going to first have to answer a few questions. So we know this piece is in E minor, the key signature is there, but we have to ask ourselves these two questions. What is the harmonic rhythm of the passage? So this is a term just meaning how often do the chords change? In a lot of pieces of music, this will usually be consistent, like, the chord changes once a measure or twice a measure most of the time. And then sometimes there might be faster chord changes that speed things up, that increase the energy, but for the most part, chord changes will happen in a consistent way. So we can ask ourselves, what is the harmonic rhythm? So we know what chord is governing at any particular time and what kinds of non-chord tones are happening above that chord. And then the second question we have to ask is, what exactly is the chord progression, or what are those chords, so that we know how the non-chord tone fits into or doesn't fit into that chord. So let's analyze this piece. So I'm just taking the left hand because I usually start with the bass to analyze a piece. So I have the bass line here and those inner voices, because both of them are going to be necessary to see what kinds of chords we have going on. Now the first one is just E, G, B. That's pretty clear. A triad in E minor is the one chord in E minor. Very straightforward, just E, G, B. The second one is also straightforward because this is also just a triad. You see A and then A, C, E up in the higher part. Now A in E minor is scale degree 1, E, F sharp, G, A. So A is scale degree 4 in E minor, meaning that this will be the 4 chord. And it is also minor. So far we've got 1 and 4, and we notice that already we have a pattern in the harmonic rhythm. We have a measure of 1 and then a measure of 4, and so we can kind of assume that the future will be like the past. In other words, like I said, there's usually a consistent harmonic rhythm, so once we see a couple of measures where there's 1 chord per measure, we can kind of assume that, okay, most of this will probably happen at 1 chord per measure. In fact, the last one does clearly only have 1 chord, but this third measure is a little trickier. So let's take a look. Here we have D and then a couple of sliding notes in the other voice. But so here I've marked D, A, and C because this starts to look familiar. Now we have D, skip line, and then A and C. That's almost close to stacking thirds. But we're kind of wondering, like, where is F or F sharp? Is the third missing here, or what's the deal? So what happened to the third? Well, if we don't have enough information in the left hand, we can always just bring back the right hand and take a look. So here, we're going to have some non-chord tones maybe, so we can't take every note at face value, but we can look for, do we have that third? Now that in the left hand, we've kind of predicted that this could be a D chord, but it seems like, where's F or F sharp? We're looking for F sharp, and if F sharp is there, then overall this is probably going to sound like a D chord. And in fact, we do have D, F sharp, A, and C, and then we have these other notes, E, B, and then E and B again. But if we do have D, F sharp, A, and C, that is actually a chord that we've learned now. We say that is a D7 chord. In E minor, D is scale degree 7, so this is a 7/7 chord, which then has those non-chord tones. We'll come back to that one, but for now, let's move on to the last chord here. Now this we see G, G, and D in the left hand. So once again, missing third, it's not enough information. What happened to, but we can already predict that there might be a B somewhere to come that would finish this chord, so to speak. G, B, D is what we're waiting for. And we do get that at the very end. Right when we achieve that final resting point of the spirit, we also achieve B there, which fills in the chord, helps to create a sense of closure. Cool, and then we have just one non-chord tone now in this measure, which is the C above the G there, that then leads down by step to B natural. So you can kind of see how these non-chord tones are fitting in already. Now, these are the chord names for the chords that we've analyzed. E minor for the 1 chord, A minor is the 4 chord, D7 or D dominant 7 is the 7/7 chord, and that leads very smoothly to G, which is the 3 chord. Now, this might be going far afield, but think if we were in the key of G here, D7 would be what? So, I'll just leave that to you to figure out, but this feels like an ending because, as I've talked about in the last video on 7th chords, a very common pattern for 7th chords is to resolve in a certain way, and go back to that video and review, and then watch this part and try and figure out if we were in the key of G major here. We're not, but if we were in the key of G major, what would D7 be in Roman numerals in the key of G major? Okay, so I'll let you figure that out. In the meantime, let's take a look at the non-chord tones. So as we went through and analyzed the piece, now we know the chords. So we can look for E's, G's, and B's. We can look for A's, C's, and E's in the 4 chord. We can look for D's, F sharps, A's, and C's in the 7/7 chord. But we're going to end up with the circled red tones that don't fit in. So those are obviously the non-chord tones. And we do have different ways of understanding the non-chord tones and kind of analyzing them, but we should notice that almost all of them have a tendency to resolve down by step to the nearest tone, or up by step as well. So down by step is clearly more common. As you can see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of them are down by step, and then one of them moves up by step. A little bit less common, but still, most of them resolve by step to the nearest chord tone. So that is not a hard and fast rule. That is just, again, a tendency. So then that allows for fluid melody. The introduction of the non-chord tones allows it to not sound so choppy, boring, versus. So moving by step adds this smoothness to the melody line and gives it shape, a melodic shape, and which is unique and contains little gestures, contains phrases, all those things that we talked about at the very beginning. And notice that as each non-chord tone resolves by step to the chord tone, that you get a little bit of a bead strung onto the thread, so that the thread is going on and then it moves in and out of the chord, and when it resolves to the chord, or when it finds its way back into the chord, then we get a little bit of just a feeling of release or of satisfaction, just like moving from a dissonance to a consonance gives us that same kind of just a tension and then a release. So each of these little beads that threads itself onto the thread comes from the non-chord tones. And some of them happen in more significant ways than others. Some of them have a more kind of complete resolution feeling to them, especially like that ending one, or the two that break off the sections there. Okay, now let's take a look at another piece that is also by Chopin that also features very beautiful melody. In fact, I played this one at the beginning of the video. While the last excerpt had a whole bunch of non-chord tones of different kinds, and we haven't quite learned all the different kinds yet, we'll come back to that. In the meantime, this one is a little bit more straightforward, has just one kind of non-chord tone in it. So let's figure out what those are. So we're going to have to do the same thing with this passage. And then it'll start again. It'll sort of kind of come to a pause there and then start again. Pause and then start again. Before coming to a bigger finish a little bit later in the piece. So if we just take this first part, and we have to ask ourselves those same questions we did before. First, what is the harmonic rhythm of this passage? How often does the chord change? And then what are the chords? So actually in this passage, it's interesting. The chords change twice per measure now. And you notice we have a bass, boom, yum, and then the inner voices that come in. So we can use those to then analyze what the chords are. Let's take a look. So here we're in F minor. We start on F. We've got 4 flats in the key signature. This is clearly an F minor feel in this piece. And you can see in the melody the dominant up to tonic relationship from C up to F as well. So in this case, we can see, as I said, even just in the left hand, we've got F, A flat, C, and F again. And that's plenty enough to tell us that this is the one chord in F minor. And we'll take a look at the melody too. And the melody in this case, just C and F, more of the same. So this whole thing is just F minor. There's no non-chord tones here. This is all within the chord. All right, let's keep going. Let's do the same thing with the next chord. So G, E flat, B flat, and E flat. Now if I rearrange those, I'll get E flat, G, and B flat. Here they are here with G in the bass. So we don't want to forget about the inversion. Now we have G in the bass, so we'll keep it in our reduction in the same inversion. Now we have G, B flat, and E flat. Rearrange this one more time and we get E flat, G, B flat, and that is the E flat major chord. Let's take a look at the melody. Now this time we have E flat and a new note, D flat, and hey, is this a non-chord tone? So we may think at first that this is a non-chord tone, but now think back to our seventh chords. Double check if this is actually a seventh above the chord. Now if we put this in root position, we get E flat, G, B flat, and D flat, making this the dominant seventh above E flat. So this is actually a seventh chord in first inversion. This is an E flat seven chord over G. And that is now in yellow because that is actually a chord tone. So D flat can be considered here a chord tone. This is all just the 7/7 chord again, but this time in first inversion. And as we saw last time, 7/7 went to what chord? 7/7 went to 3. Here we might guess 7/6/5, maybe do a similar thing, and we would be right. Because here we have A flat, C, and A flat. A flat and C, that's enough to imply a triad because that's the root and the third. So it's not like it's missing the third or missing the root, it's missing the fifth, and the fifth is one that can be missing. So we can have an A flat triad with a missing fifth. And it'll sort of be implied, as we've talked about before. Now let's look at the melody. So we have C again, and then B natural, whoa, and D flat. Okay, so both B natural and D flat, there's no way those can be made to fit in an A flat chord. These are actually clearly non-chord tones. They're working like non-chord tones. They're working like a specific type of non-chord tones, which we'll talk about in a second. So B natural and D flat are non-chord tones over this A flat major chord, as I said. That is the 3 chord. Just like in the previous example, we saw the 7/7 chord went to 3. Here in this example, 7/6/5 chord goes to 3 as well. Chopin seems to like this kind of progression where he gets to the 3 chord by using the 7 chord. It's cool. So finally we can arrive at the last chord, and this chord is also a 7th chord. If we take the E natural, the G, and the B flat, and the C, and we stack those up like this, keeping E natural in the bass just to remind us of the inversion. We notice take the C down the octave, re-invert it back into root position. You'll find out that this is a C dominant 7th chord, or a C7 chord, which is in first inversion over E natural in the bass, which is the 5 chord in F minor. So we can call this 5/6/5. Those are the figured bass for 7th chords. Don't worry about it. You can just write C7 over E. So now we've analyzed this and we've found only 2 non-chord tones. So to talk about these, I'm going to go into light mode and then take a look. Now I'm just looking at these last 2 chords here, and I want you to notice that C is the 3rd of the A flat major chord. So the little yellow dot means C is in the chord. So that's representing C. C is the 3rd of the A flat major chord, and then it appears again still in the A flat major chord, and then look, it appears again as a half note. Now C is there as the root of the 5/7 or the 5/6/5 chord, the C7 chord over E. So C is a chord member the whole time. C is in the chord. It's in both chords. It's the 3rd and then it's the root, but it's a chord tone the whole time. Then it's decorated, it's embellished, it's ornamented by those 2 non-chord tones, B natural and D flat. It's being embellished by the circled non-chord tones. So we can see that this creates a shape. Over A flat, it's in the chord, and then over E natural, it's in this chord too. And then we get this shape in the melody, this melodic, this smooth melodic shape. So we go out of the chord. If I just play an A flat natural chord here, or if I just play an A flat major chord here, and then I play C, and then I dip down, then I create this little shape, a little decoration, and then I go again. I can do this whole thing over an A flat major chord. Right? But it's even more effective if I change chords. It's cool. So C is in both of those chords, and it's decorated over both of those chords with these little gestures, these little shapes. And this first shape that dips downwards like this is going to be called a lower neighbor. So these are neighbor tones. They just go to the next door neighbor note and then come back. That's creating that dip down shape, or the lower neighbor tone. And then the next one creates this shape that's kind of reaching up and then coming back down. That is what we're going to call, obviously, an upper neighbor tone. So C here experiences both a lower neighbor and an upper neighbor, and that actually works to extend the C through the whole measure without it getting too boring. And non-chord tones are really effective at making more interest in a melody than it would otherwise have with just the chord tones. But now it's important for me to mention too that these can both be diatonic, as you see with the D flat. D flat's in the key signature, that's in the key, that's the diatonic upper neighbor, but it can also be a chromatic neighbor. Just like in the first one, it's chromatic lower neighbor because B flat is in the key, but here Chopin's written B natural. Whatever works best, whatever seems to make a smoother or more beautiful melody. So now we can start to make a chart of the different kinds of non-chord tones. Let's start with just all the different kinds of neighbor tones that are possible. So remember that these can all be either chromatic or diatonic. We've seen the lower neighbor tone. In this case, in the Chopin, it was chromatic. Remember, in this chart, I'll just use the yellow dots meaning the chord tones and then the red circles meaning the non-chord tones. So this is just kind of the abstract representation. Now, remember the upper neighbor tone that we saw in the Chopin was diatonic and works like this. These can decorate any chord tone, whether C was the root, whether C was the third, whether C was the fifth. Any of these chord tones can have an upper or a lower neighbor in order to decorate them. Now, we also saw how they can be combined to extend out even further, so you can have a lower and then an upper neighbor. And it returns to C in the middle in this case. But we will also see a shape that looks more like this, which is sometimes called a double neighbor or called changing tones, where there's both an upper and a lower neighbor, but without returning to C in the middle. And so let me just play these. The chromatic lower neighbor, as we heard, was... And then the diatonic upper neighbor. Now those are both half steps, but in this case, D flat is in the key and B natural is not in the key. And then we saw how they can be combined. Like that. And then we didn't see this, but just so you know it's possible, that you can have more than one non-chord tone before you return to the chord tone. And that can create some real interesting kinds of tension. And note, as I said before, that these work over any chord as long as they bear the same relationships to the chord. So neighbor tones are really powerful because they, lift up away from that chord tone and then return, or dip down away from the chord tone and then return. So they create, as I've been talking about, these kinds of tensions and relaxations, dissonances, and consonances. Great, so that's for that piece. Let's return to the E minor Mazurka that we started with. This one has a few different kinds of non-chord tones in it, so it'll be worth taking a minute going through each one and kind of exploring how they are. Now, there actually aren't any neighbor tones in this one. This one has what we will be calling passing tones. Over this E minor chord, as we saw, we have A going down to G and F sharp going down to E. So you can even hear in those last two beats, dissonance, consonance. Dissonance with the F sharp, and then consonance with the E. And that makes all of the more interest in that measure. So as we look at how passing tones work, let's think, okay, remember that B is the fifth of this chord, G is the third of this chord, and E is the root of this chord. And then we have non-chord tones that just pass between. So that is what a passing tone is, that from one chord tone, we will move to another chord tone through. And they make this kind of shape. This is a little bit different from neighbor tones. Remember, neighbor tones went up and returned, or went down and then returned back up, as opposed to these, which then smoothly connect two different chord tones together. So these are just different ways of decorating or embellishing the chords that have these different and interesting effects. Now, we're going to have a few different kinds of passing tone too. So the passing tone, thinking all the way back to week 1, we talked about how there are different patterns of emphasis in the measure, or some beats are stronger and some beats are relatively weaker. Remember in 3/4 we had this pattern: down, up, down, up for 1, 2, 3, and the downbeat was always the strongest beat. Well, interestingly, this first non-chord tone, the A, appears above E on the downbeat, on that strongest beat, and that actually will create a more energetic movement there. When that non-chord tone comes in on the beat, it kind of emphasizes it or accents it. So we call these accented passing tones. The non-chord tones that appear on the strong parts of the measure. The passing tones that appear on the weaker parts of the measure, we can just call normal passing tones to distinguish them from the accented passing tone, which is really going to have all that much more energetic motion in it, as I said. Good. And then with this next non-chord tone, it's very interesting what happens here, because over the A minor chord, we have a D, and D is just a fourth over A minor, over A, just a fourth over, a perfect fourth above A, but it is in relation to the other notes of the A minor chord, is a dissonance, because if you look in A minor, we have A, C, and E, and D there is a non-chord tone and is dissonant with these notes. So when we have at C, we finally get a resolution there. But what kind of non-chord tone is this? Is this a passing tone? It is accented, like we saw in the previous measure where A is an accented passing tone over E. Here, D is an accented non-chord tone over A, but it's not a passing tone really, because where did it come from? It didn't have a chord tone before it. It's just the very beginning of the measure. We leap up from E to D and then resolve to C. So where is it passing from? Well, there's a couple ways to think about this, which is that E is actually sort of there. That E is sort of there for the D to pass from to C. And we can maybe call this an accented incomplete passing tone, because it's incomplete because it doesn't have an origin point. Where did it come from? Well, it came from this big leap up from E. Well, notice that E down here to D to C does kind of make a passing tone figure. If we just take it down the octave, E, D, C would be a passing tone over A minor, right? You know, if we just take A, C, E are the notes of A minor, then we pass down from E to C. That works like a normal accented passing tone. So we can think of it this way, where the E is sort of there in our imagination, just as a origin point for that D dissonance to come from. This is just one way to think of it. I think it's kind of interesting. Nevertheless, we have what here is usually called an appoggiatura, another fancy Italian term. And this is just a special name for non-chord tones that leap up to a dissonance or a non-chord tone, and then often are accented, so the non-chord tone appears on a strong beat. Appoggiaturas usually leap up from a chord tone of the previous chord, and then resolve down by step to the chord tone of the new chord. Okay, so that's appoggiatura. Remember that it leaps up to a dissonance, usually on a strong beat, and then resolves down by step. Leap up to a dissonance, resolve down by step. That's an appoggiatura. So what about at the very end, that similar gesture that happens? Remember, we have appoggiatura. And then here, when we leap up to C over G, it resolves down to B to complete the chord here. This is another accented incomplete passing tone. In other words, this is another appoggiatura. So we leap from D to C and then resolve to B to complete that G major chord, the 3 chord in E minor. And once again, here we can imagine a D preceding it, right? D just up the octave would come down through C as kind of an incomplete passing tone, as we've said. Kind of coming from this D7 chord, imagining a D up here, then over the G, C to B. That does create our incomplete passing tone, or appoggiatura, once again. And you can see how that resolves to the B. It kind of gathers up all this energy of the whole section of the piece and points it towards that one note. To complete the chord, we are just waiting on B to make that chord whole, because all of that energy of the passage is worked into that one note there at the end. That gives us a fall, gives us a sense of cadence or of closure there. Okay, so now we've come to the most challenging part, or this chord, the third measure, which has the most moving notes. Now here, at the very start, we have over D, C and E and B. So at the very first chord of this measure, the very first vertical collection of notes, it's not really a chord that we've learned, right? D, C, E, and B. It's these notes. You know, if we collect them all together, this is not a triad at all. It doesn't, B, C, D, and E. But the way Chopin has it spread out sounds really pretty, but these notes have motion in them. They have to go somewhere. They need to resolve. And so, as I say, by the end of the measure, we get D, A, C, and D. But we have also just come from F sharp. So at the very end of the measure, as I said before, we do collect up our D7 chord there. So how are we going to talk about all these different notes that are going on and all these dissonances and things? Well, let's just take them one by one. So this first one with the B natural over D is actually just an accented passing tone. We can see that it comes from C, which is a chord tone of the previous chord, and then it goes to A, which is a chord tone in the current chord. So B here, think of it as an accented passing tone. It comes in on the beat and resolves by step to A. The other one down here is kind of more difficult, right? But we might think of this as an appoggiatura. Actually, it comes from a chord tone A, it leaps to a non-chord tone and resolves by step, this time going up. And it's good to know that a lot of these can happen in both directions. Appoggiatura can be a leap up, resolve down by step, or a leap down, which resolves up by step. And in this case, that's what happens here. So A and F sharp are the goal notes. And we get before completing the chord with D there. The way that appoggiatura works is subtle, it's kind of hidden, but I think it's really effective and really cool. And like I said, it makes for a unique melodic gesture there. And actually, just like some of the other appoggiaturas we've seen, this one can also be imagined as an incomplete passing tone coming from D, which is a chord tone. Obviously, D is the root of this chord. So coming from D through E to F sharp, if we just add a D into the measure, you'll barely notice the difference here. So we can totally think of it as an incomplete passing tone in this case, as an appoggiatura that implies the presence of another note there. It should be mentioned though, since we learned about 9th and 13th chords, how do we know when it's a non-chord tone and when it's actually a 9th chord or a 13th chord? Now, in this case, D, F sharp, A, C makes a 7th chord. Then we make a 9th. That would be E. And there's 11th, which would be G. That's not in the chord, but there is a B, so a 13th, which makes a really nice sounding chord. And we do hear that. We do hear that whole thing at the beginning. Like, how do we know if the chord is just this or if it's actually this? Well, we don't. It's very ambiguous. So when it comes to analysis, we just have to make decisions like this. I am going to stick with 7/7 here. And here's why. Because now it wouldn't be wrong to put 7/9 or 7/13 here, because those notes are here and they do appear. But here's my rationale. I think that the circle tones, in this case B and E, even if we consider them part of the chord, they are still behaving like non-chord tones in this music. Because take a look how we've just talked about how one is an accented passing tone and one looks like an appoggiatura or an incomplete passing tone. And so really they're doing the same kind of thing as we would expect from non-chord tones. So they're not, I think of it as both. They're both part of the overall sound of the chord, but really this chord is 7/7 underneath. And those are just decorations. But you might argue, you might come back and say, hey, I also see E and B down there in the left hand. They're doubled, Maybe they really are part of the chord, right? But even these ones in the left hand also move by step 2 chord tones of the 7/7. So in the end, they do also act like non-chord tones, in this case, passing tones, heading down to chord members of the 7/7, from E down to D, from B down to A. Okay, so those we're going to consider non-chord tones, but overall, they do kind of still have that sound of the 7/9, 7/13 chord. I wouldn't count that wrong. I think these kinds of things with music and analysis are interesting. There's no right answer. There's lots of wrong answers. There's lots of things that you could write here that would be completely out of left field that wouldn't be right. But there are several right answers for many things in analysis, and I think that's okay. Music is ambiguous, or music is just not specific enough to keep us guessing and to keep us on our toes, and I think that's important to remember when we're doing analysis and doing music theory. Okay, so now we've really covered the main kinds of non-chord tones that I want to get to in this video. We've seen neighbor tones, we've seen the lower neighbor tone, the upper neighbor tone, we've seen lower and upper neighbor tones, how those can work to extend out a single note over a chord, over multiple chords, in which case that will decorate or ornament that note, make it a little bit less boring. And then, as we've seen, we also have passing tone, and passing tones can smooth out a melody by taking arpeggios or taking chord members and connecting them in one linear thread. And appoggiaturas do a very similar kind of thing, except they leap up and create a sense of tension by leaping to a dissonance and then resolving by step. And those are kind of even more significant kinds of passing tones, remembering that all of these can be either diatonic or chromatic. And we also have seen how appoggiaturas, like I was saying, sort of imply another chord tone, or can be considered incomplete passing tones if they're used that way. And maybe they're used in different ways. And of course, there's probably other ways. I think these are just the basic ones that are really good to know in order to understand a whole lot of non-chord tones as they appear over chords in music. These are crucial building blocks of good melody. We saw how if I excise all of the non-chord tones from this melody, how it becomes really not that interesting. Not at all the same kind of... How much more juicy is that, right? So what we do is we put the non-chord tones back in there in its complete version, this opening phrase. Actually, if we keep going a little bit, we can see some other examples which are just cool to briefly look at. Of course, I'll let you discover the rest, but if we just analyze this chord in the next measure, we see B, F sharp, and A. Once again, B, F sharp, and A might not be enough to determine the whole chord here, but we can kind of start filling in the gaps. What's missing? Well, in E minor, we're going to have oftentimes the raised scale degree 7. This is harmonic minor. So that we'll have B, F sharp, A, and D sharp. Raised leading tone. And then complete this chord. B, D sharp, F sharp, A is a B7 chord, which in E minor is 5/7 capital because it has D sharp raised leading tone, making it the dominant 7th. And this resolves again to 1, to E minor here. So now that we know that, we can look closely at the melody, and we see that right here over B, we get this pattern in the right hand in the melody. B, C natural, C sharp, D, and then finally D sharp. So only here at the very last minute is the whole chord put together. In fact, those are 3 chromatic passing tones in a row. They connect B to D sharp, just moving by half step each time. And then one more half step resolves to E minor. And there's a F sharp there that works as a passing tone to connect E, the root, to G, the 3rd. And then it leaps up to C and comes back down to B. So if it leaps up to C, which is not in E minor chord, leaps up to C there, comes back down to B, that is an appoggiatura. It leaps to a dissonance and resolves by half step to B. Okay, so let's end the video by taking a look at some phrasing in this piece as we look at it a little bit more zoomed out. How has Chopin organized his resting points of the spirit over the course of this piece? So I'll use little blue marks to kind of create smaller breaks and smaller phrases, and then lighter blue to make bigger connections, and then really light blue or kind of almost green blue to make the big arches that will connect it. And we'll just do this, we'll listen to the piece, and I'll try to follow along making the phrases for you.